Well, it's been 1 year since a chemical attack in Syria killed more than 1,000 people. This attack prompted international outrage and threats of military intervention and an eventual deal to disarm Damascus. But 1 year later, with the chemical weapons relinquished, the Syria conflict remains volatile. The humanitarian crisis, it's only intensified. CCTV's Liling joins us now from the UN with perspective on this anniversary. We've seen some progress in terms of the destruction of chemical weapons, but has there really been much success in ending the conflict itself in Syria?
In a word, no, at least not in the context of the bigger picture now. However, in the context of the chemical weapons removal and destruction, yes, the most dangerous chemical weapons in Syria's stockpile have been removed and were in fact just this week destroyed on the U.S. ship Cape Ray. However, the situation in Syria, as you said, remains volatile, and the civilian death toll continues to rise. The number of people displaced is still increasing. And a word of caution to our viewers, some of the following images are graphic. August 21st, 2013, 1 year ago. Shocking images from social media gave the world a glimpse of the horror and anguish following a chemical weapons attack in the Damascus suburb of eastern Ghouta. The scenes of the dead, men, women and children, shook the international community and prompted calls for accountability and action. Western countries said a UN investigation indicated the Assad government was responsible for the attack, while Syria and Russia blamed the rebels. The UK and the US moved for a military response. To head off an intervention, the Syrian government agreed to hand over its chemical weapons stockpile for destruction. The last of those weapons were destroyed this week aboard the U.S. ship Cape Ray. But where does that leave the Syrian crisis and the nearly 3 million Syrians displaced?
Definitely the effort to disarm of all of its chemical weapons was successful only, I think, to some extent.
Dr. Alan Ben Meir is a professor at NYU Center for Global Affairs and an expert on the Middle East.
I think the chemical agreement, albeit was useful to some extent, it does deviate the attention of the international community from the real slaughter that's been taking place in Syria.
A slaughter said to be largely perpetrated by extremist groups who have helped turn the conflict between government forces and rebel groups into a regional crisis and a humanitarian tragedy. The Obama administration in June moved to provide moderate rebel forces with $500 million to train and equip them in their fight to oust Assad, but that has been criticized as too little, too late.
Had the United States intervened early on in Syria, going back nearly 3 years ago, I strongly believe that neither ISIS or Al-Qaeda would have been able to acquire such a foothold in Syria. So I think the reluctance of the United States, of the Obama administration, to intervene early was nothing short of a disaster.
The international community has also been criticized for neglecting the Syrian conflict. A year ago, after that chemical attack, Syria dominated the headlines. But since then, it has fallen somewhat by the wayside as other crises emerged, including in Ukraine, Iraq, and of course, on the Gaza Strip. But Syria remains in turmoil, and it's back in the headlines this week, not just because it's the 1 year anniversary of that chemical attack, but also, of course, because of the execution of U.S. journalist James Foley by Islamic State militants in Syria.
Liling, you talked about nearly 3 million people displaced. That number staggering. It's still such a humanitarian tragedy. Frame the situation for us. What does it look like right now, and how much has been accomplished?
Well, the humanitarian situation remains very critical. Efforts have been made and some success seen there in terms of delivering aid and humanitarian supplies to Syrians displaced within and outside of Syria. Now, one thing we heard also that from the UNHCR, its latest figures put, as you said, that number of people displaced at 3 million. These are just a number of people registered with the UN Refugee Agency. Some 30,000 people remain unregistered, and they have been displaced. Now, of all the people who have been registered with the agency, 25%, that's a quarter of them, are children from newborns to 17-year-olds. And of course, in terms of the death toll, the UN has stopped updating that figure because it has been difficult to verify the numbers. But we heard this week from activists that the number of people killed in the Syrian conflict have has topped 180,000. And here's how urgent action is required, is needed. The UN Secretary General just issued a press statement saying that the international community has a moral obligation to end this expanding conflict that is already destabilizing the region.
Liling live for us at the United Nations. Thanks so much.